The blizzard howled beyond, its frigid gusts pounding the walls of Evan's cottage. Inside, the retired paramedic settled in his den, the radiance of the hearth sending flickering silhouettes along the walls. The snowfall had cut him off for ages, and the hush was broken only by the periodic snap of the logs in the flames. Then a noise disturbed the quiet, a faint, urgent scraping. Evan scowled, placing his cup of tea aside. He listened intently. And there it was once more, this time paired with a muffled sob. He rose, his pulse starting to hammer. The noise was coming from the main door, edging carefully toward the foyer. Evan's eyes widened as he neared the paneled door. There, silhouetted against the drifting frost, stood a Belgian Malinois, her figure trembling from chill. Pressed firmly alongside her were 2-minute pups, hardly discernible beneath her protective form. Ice clung to her coat, and her exhales materialized in feeble wisps as she peered at Evan. With eyes brimming with need, Evan paused, his fingers hovering over the handle. He sensed that unbolting the door might invite complications into his refuge. Yet as her gaze locked on his, something deep inside him awakened. The step he was about to take would alter all their lives irrevocably. Evan's heartbeat thundered while he remained statue still before the door. The gale surged behind the shaking Malinois, her breath misting the iced glass. Her posture was bent low, shielding the pair of newborns who pressed into her side, their tiny forms nearly buried in the accumulating snow. Evan could discern her ribs through her fur, her coat tangled with frost, and her expression pleading, desperate and alive with a blend of terror and longing aimed right at him. "What on earth happened to you?" he murmured under his breath, his voice dissipating in the chilly interior. Spontaneously, he reached for the latch. At the first creak of the door, the polar wind burst into the room, bringing the unrelenting freeze. The Malinois did not budge, her paws planted firmly on the threshold. She stayed perfectly rigid, her gaze trained on Evan as though debating whether or not to rely on him. "Let's go, girl, come inside," Evan invited, squatting low to seem less threatening. "You'll freeze if you stay out there." Her faint whine drifted to him. She glanced at her pups before moving forward, her steps careful and deliberate. She nudged one pup with her muzzle, encouraging it to tag along. The smaller one toppled awkwardly in the drifts, its minuscule legs flailing to keep up. Without a second thought, the mother lifted it gently by the back of the neck and carried it inside, followed by the sibling. As soon as they had crossed the threshold, Evan secured the door behind them, muffling the storm's ruthless chorus. The sudden warmth caused the Malinois to quake harder, her body adjusting to the shift in temperature. Evan retrieved an old quilt from the sofa and laid it carefully over mother and pups. She flinched at first, but upon realizing he meant no injury, she issued a protracted trembling sigh and curled near the blaze, protectively surrounding her offspring. Evan crouched next to her, his mind racing. The pups were so small, their eyelids scarcely open, and they were so frail. He noted the faint movements of their rib cages with labored respirations. He reached out to touch one, but the mother growled low. It wasn't hostile, merely a caution, a signal that she remained cautious. All right, he muttered, raising both palms in surrender. "I understand you're a caring parent. You've really been through it, haven't you?" He stood and reached for a bowl in the kitchen, filling it with tepid water, setting it by the dog. He backed off, granting her distance. She observed him warily, but finally bent forward, lapping at the water while her little ones snuggled closer. Evan looked on from a short distance, his thoughts whirling. Who is she? How did she end up in a snowstorm with newborns? She was obviously alone for quite some time, just barely surviving, but unwilling to abandon hope. That she had traveled this far with her pups in the blizzard was nothing short of astonishing. Now, Evan hadn't expected this, though. He was fond of dogs. His retirement had been peaceful. He'd been without a pet for a long while, and picturing himself caring for 3 canines, particularly in dire need, was daunting. Still, seeing the mother's worn body and how she huddled over her pups, he realized he couldn't turn them away. "You're a scrappy fighter, that's for sure," he commented softly. "Guess that makes 2 of us." As night fell, Evan worked to improve their comfort. He lined the area with soft towels for the pups, put down some nourishment near the mother, and fed the fire to keep the area toasty. The Malinois monitored him intently, her gaze tracking his every action, but over time her stance softened. Eventually, she let her head rest, the tension leaving her eyes. Evan took his seat, the flames dancing in the background, and felt an odd sense of belonging. He was clueless about what lay ahead, but for the moment, he had done what was possible. And as the storm rampaged outdoors, he silently vowed that these 3 would be protected, nothing would harm them. By the next daybreak, Evan stirred to the quiet sound of little yelps, and the remains of the fire popping the blizzard had eased, leaving a layer of fresh snow that shimmered in the faint morning rays. He rubbed his face, and immediately recalled the unforeseen visitors in his house. He turned his head to see the Malinois curled protectively around her pups. The young ones squirmed faintly, their tiny shapes shifting under her watchful guard. The mother's ears flicked in response to Evan's movement, her tawny eyes flicking his way. There was a trace of vigilance in them, but without last night's urgency. Morning, girl, he said in a gentle tone while he stretched, heading for the kitchen. Let's see what I can find to feed you. He rummaged through the cupboards and dug out a can of veggie stew. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Warming it on the stovetop, Evan carefully set a dish close to her. She lifted her muzzle, testing the aroma, and after a pause began to eat. The pups, sensing her change in position, squeaked softly and wriggled nearer her warmth. Evan knelt at a small distance, watching her eat. You're a tough soul, he remarked quietly, hauling these babies through the winds. You deserve much better than all this. As the morning progressed, Evan evaluated their condition. The mother was visibly undernourished, her protruding bones plainly visible. The two pups, though fragile, seemed alert enough to nurse, their minuscule tails vibrating slightly as they nuzzled their mother's belly. Evan felt a pang in his chest. It was a scene of desperate struggle that touched him in a way his time as a paramedic never had. Deciding more aid was necessary, Evan placed a call to the closest vet clinic. Hello, I'm Evan Brooks, he said when the receptionist answered. I've got a Belgian Malinois and her 2 newborns here. They're not in good shape. Could you possibly take a look? The receptionist sounded kind, but businesslike. Sure, Mr. Brooks, come by later, and we'll do an exam. Relieved, Evan glanced over at the Malinois, who was licking her pups carefully, her maternal instincts still strong despite her exhaustion. You hear that? Girl will get you the help you need. Transporting them was no easy matter. Evan located an old wrap and gingerly coaxed the mother onto it. She resisted, her body rigid, and growled softly whenever Evan leaned too close to her youngsters. It's fine, he murmured in a reassuring voice, moving carefully. I promise no harm will come to them. After several minutes of patient persuasion, she yielded, allowing him to lift her into the vehicle. With her pups nestling in the makeshift bed, Evan drove gingerly on the slick roads, his mind teeming with questions. Who owned her? Had she been deliberately dumped somewhere or accidentally lost in the merciless cold? At the practice, the team responded swiftly, skilled hands assessing mother and pups. She's severely malnourished, commented Dr. Morgan as she slid her palms along the dog's thin torso, but she's got spirit. Her little ones are fortunate. She kept them going. Dr. Morgan regarded Evan with a thoughtful look. She's had a hard go of it, but with time and proper care she'll bounce back. Any idea where she came from? Evan shook his head. She just arrived at my cottage last night. I couldn't leave her. The vet smiled gently while she arrived at the right house. After returning home with them, the Malinois appeared calmer, her pups fed and wiggling happily at her side. Evan settled nearby, gazing as she finally let herself unwind. She allowed him to be close, watching him through eyes that softened whenever he reached out to pat her muzzle. You're safe here now, he said, his voice thick with empathy. I don't know what happened to you, but you can stay as long as you need. For the first time, the Malinois leaned into his hand, her posture no longer braced in fear. Evan felt a knot tighten in his throat. He'd let her in on impulse, never guessing how things would turn out, yet seeing her trust start to flourish, he sensed they had each discovered something they lacked: a purpose and maybe a shot at renewal. In the ensuing days, a steady pattern of healing and trust emerged. The Malinois whom Evan had begun naming Willow gradually regained her vigor, her once dull stare acquired a glint of life, and the pups whom he'd christened Frost and Ember became livelier day by day. Evan spent large chunks of time on the rug by the fire, letting Willow adapt to him. Initially, she regarded him warily, her shape tensed and cautious, but little by little the defenses she'd erected began to wane. She allowed him to sit closer, her mild growls subsiding into audible sighs, and finally, she permitted him to pet her without recoiling. On a particular blustery evening, Evan rested on the rug, leaning on the couch, watching the embers glow. Willow lay a short distance away, her snout on her paws, as Frost and Ember fumbled endearingly around each other, wagging tiny tails. Evan beamed at their spirited clumsiness. You've sure got determined little ones, Willow, he said. Quietly looking her way, she lifted her muzzle and studied Her gaze filled with what he could only define as appreciation. He carefully extended his hand, gently ruffling her fur. To his surprise, she didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed against his touch, letting the tension in her body dissolve. As the weeks passed, Willow's transformation became obvious. Her coat, once ragged and thin, now glistened, and her protruding ribs were less noticeable. Her vitality returned in playful spurts. She chased her pups, nudging them and watching as they tottered around with squeaky attempts at barking. Evan also felt himself evolving. For years, he'd inhabited the cottage on his own, content with a life of solitude and retirement, but Willow and her offspring introduced an energy he hadn't known. He craved. The previously silent evenings were filled with adorable yips and the pitter-patter of tiny paws. He had not realized how deeply he had missed a sense of direction until now. One mild afternoon, Evan was chopping wood out back when he noticed Willow peering out a window, her nose against the glass with frost and ember rolling about at her feet. He paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and gave a quick wave to Willow, who gave a delicate wag of her tail, just once, enough to warm his heart. Upon heading inside, Willow greeted him by the door, her tail flicking a bit as she nudged his palm with her muzzle. It was the first time she had approached voluntarily, and Evan couldn't suppress a grin. "Well, you're quite bold today," he teased, crouching to scratch behind her ear. Willow leaned into him, wagging more strongly, while Frost and Ember yipped excitedly and circled his legs. As their bond deepened, Evan began to wonder about Willow's past, how she'd ended up outside his door that fateful stormy evening. The puzzle stayed with him, but he was certain of one fact: however severe her history, she had survived with her children in tow, a true testament to her fighting spirit. Night came, and they nestled together near the fire. Evan said softly to Willow, "I don't know where you came from, but I'm thankful you found your way here. You and these little rascals, you all belong now." Willow lifted her muzzle, meeting his gaze. There was something there, a calm understanding, a rapport beyond language. She exhaled softly and rested her chin on his leg, her body wholly relaxed. Since arriving, Evan fought back emotion as he stroked her fur. He hadn't expected that a desperate dog and pups would alter his life so dramatically, but while sitting there in the warmth, hearing Willow and her babies breathe, he realized they had given him something missing all along: camaraderie, intention, and a flicker of renewed optimism. Part 4: Remnants of History. The sunrise peeked through the cottage windows, illuminating bright rays across the boards where Frost and Ember toppled over each other. Willow lay close by, her eyes partly shut, though her ears twitched at any faint stir. Evan, leaning against the kitchen counter, sipped coffee and watched them with a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. Though things looked idyllic, a nagging doubt gnawed at the fringe of his thoughts. Where had Willow truly come from? She displayed the signs of adversity, her lean frame, subtle scars on her coat, the skittish way she reacted if startled. Obviously someone had failed her, and Evan couldn't shake the notion that whoever it was could still be out there. That day after lunch, Evan decided to lead Willow and the pups outdoors. The drifts had receded, revealing hardened patches of earth. Willow stepped gingerly off the porch, sniffing the breeze like she was checking for threats. The pups, still unsteady, trailed close behind, chirping in excitement at the unfamiliar scenery. Evan smiled. "You're secure now, girl," he murmured gently. "No one's going to harm you here." But shortly into their exploration, Willow abruptly stiffened, her ears jutting upward, her posture bristling as she directed her nose toward the trioline. Evan aligned his stare with hers, his own muscles tensing. "What is it?" he murmured, moving closer. Willow let out a low snarl, her mane standing on end. Evan peered into the forest, but he observed nothing. Still, Willow's protective stance told him all he needed. There was something lurking. Quickly, he gathered the pups, holding them tight as he coaxed Willow back into the cottage. Once inside, he locked up and drew the curtains, his pulse racing. Willow continued pacing near the window, glancing nervously at the woods. That evening, as Evan dozed by the flames, he couldn't escape the sense of dread. Willow lay nearby, her puppies curled against her flank, but she never fully relaxed. Her eyes darted to the door at every shuffle. Evan placed a hand on her fur quietly, asking, "You've encountered something like this before, right?" His mind drifted while he stared into the embers. He could scarcely imagine Willow's ordeals. Had someone hurt her, abandoned her? The notion made him clench his jaw. Whoever was responsible had no claim to decency. The following morning, Evan resolved to find out more. He loaded Willow and her pups into his vehicle and headed into the small town. The local rescue center was modest, but run by devoted staff members who recognized many of the area's strays. Evan approached the reception, carrying a snapshot of Willow with her babies. "I discovered her near my place," he informed the woman behind the counter, a friendly middle-aged lady named Anna. "Any Chance someone reported her missing, or do you know her? Anna examined the picture briefly, then shook her head. I'm not familiar with this dog, she replied, but cases like hers happen too often, and scrupulous breeders keep dogs in horrific conditions then cast them out once they aren't needed. Evan felt anger flare. So you're telling me she was likely dumped? Anna nodded sadly. Yes, I'm afraid. So still she got lucky. When she found you driving back, Evan sat silent behind the wheel thinking about what Anna had said. Willow had been discarded, tossed aside, as though she didn't matter, but she mattered to her babies and to him, and he'd make sure she never felt worthless again. Upon reaching the cottage, Willow hopped from the car, sniffing the air, tail flicking softly behind her. Frost and Ember waddled after her, small limbs working overtime. Evan observed them, his heart filling with both rage at her mistreatment and gratitude for her survival. You're safe now, he told Willow resolutely. No one can harm you again. Willow gazed at him, her deep eyes warming for the first time. Evan believed she truly grasped the meaning behind his statement. He quietly vowed that nobody who had hurt her would ever repeat it. Over the next few days, things settled into a tense lull. Willow eased a bit more each sunrise, her confidence in Evan solidifying. Frost and Ember scurried around, discovering every nook of the cottage, squeaking excitedly. Still, a prickle of paranoia nagged at Evan's awareness. It felt like something lingered out there. One late evening, his suspicion was confirmed. Evan was perched by the window, absent-mindedly stroking Willow's neck as Frost and Ember dozed by the fireplace. A bright moon illuminated the snow-laden yard outside, stretching the shadows across the property. That's when Evan spotted it, a lone shape hovering at the perimeter of the clearing. Evan's stomach sank. He squinted to make out the figure, tall, hidden by darkness, but undeniably human. It remained still, offered no sound, just stood watching Willow. He whispered quietly. The Malinois snapped to attention, her eyes following his line of sight. As soon as she saw the shape, she rumbled a fierce warning, leaping to shield Frost and Ember. Evan quickly yanked the curtains closed and snatched his phone, dialing the local station. Hello, I'm Evan Brooks, he said, striving to keep composure. Someone's outside my home. I have no idea who, but they've been at the edge of the property for a while. The operator assured him a patrol would come soon, but Evan's anxiety spiked. Something about this was too methodical, too personal. Seconds stretched into an eternity as Evan waited. Willow stood guard by the entrance, letting out low snarls while he paced, glancing fearfully at the window. Eventually, headlights cut through the night. Evan exhaled in relief as a cruiser pulled into his driveway. Officer Knight, a tall, no-frills woman with keen eyes, climbed out. Evan met her at the door, explaining everything. It's not just a random walker, he insisted. They were deliberately watching. Knight nodded, her hand resting on her torch. I'll look around, remain inside, and secure your doors. Evan nodded, dread roiling in his gut as he watched her vanish into the shadows, her light beam flickering among the branches. He hovered by the window, fists clenched. Willow stayed beside him, focused on the same area, her entire body taut. At Knight's return, she wore a grave look. No one's there now, she reported, but I discovered prints leading right to the edge of your lawn. Definitely someone was lurking. Evan swallowed thickly. Did you see anything else? Knight paused. I spotted a length of rope tied around a trunk. It's worn but appears recently used. I suspect someone's camping or loitering out there. Shiver crawled over Evan. Do you think they'll show up again? She sighed. Tough to say, but we'll have units patrol near here regularly. Call us if you see anything more. After she left the cottage, felt weighed down by tension. Evan locked the place up, every window, every door, his mind swimming with questions. Who was out there? Why so interested in Willow and the pups? As he slumped into a chair, Willow ambled over, placing her muzzle on his knee. He ran his fingers through her fur, whispering, no one will hurt you or these pups while I'm around. Willow let out a hushed whimper, her eyes meeting his for the first time since arriving. Evan read something there that he hadn't seen before. Fear merged with recognition. She knew the presence in the woods, and it terrified her. Sleepless hours FO load as Evan kept vigil near the window, a rifle propped against the wall next to him, ready. Willow curled at his feet, her ears flickering at every creak. Frost and Ember napped together by the fire, oblivious to the threat concealed in the forest. As the night dragged on, Evan formed a silent promise. Whatever or whoever lurked, he would guard Willow and her little ones at any cost. They were family now, and he refused to let their shot at happiness be stolen. When dawn peered through the drapes, casting a weak glow across the floors, Evan hadn't slept much, his thoughts consumed by that dark silhouette. Willow dozed at his side, though she would awaken at the slightest noise, while Frost and Ember dreamed away near the hearth, clueless to the strain on their guardian's mind. Evan was reaching for another cup of tea when Willow bolted to the front door, ears erect with a low growl rumbling from her chest. Evan froze mid-motion hand. Hovering over the teapot, he took up the rifle and moved warily to the window, nudging the curtain barely aside. A jolt shot through him. The shape had returned, standing much closer, now just beyond the porch. Damn, he hissed, tightening his grasp on the weapon. Turning to Willow. Stay put, he said firmly, though aware she wouldn't obey. Opening the door fractionally, Evan edged onto the stoop, his boots crunching on the frosty boards. Who's there? He demanded, trying to steady his tone. This land is private. The figure didn't answer at first, then shifted forward, revealing a man likely in his 40s, his features concealed by a threadbare hood, a coil of rope in one hand, and a sneer on his lips. That dog is mine, he stated, voice calm but dangerous. I've been tracking her. Evan's blood went cold. Your dog, he echoed in disbelief. She arrived at my place practically starved, carrying 2 puppies. If she was yours, why did she look like that? The man shrugged, stepping closer. She got away. That happens, but I came to reclaim her. Evan lifted the rifle slightly, aiming for the man's torso. You won't take her anywhere. She's not your property. Now the smirk left the man's face as he halted. You have no clue who you're dealing with, old-timer. That animal's bad news. She belongs with me. Evan's hold on the rifle steadied. No, she belongs with someone who cares. Now leave this property. Just then Willow appeared in the open doorway, her stance rigid, teeth bared as she snarled fiercely. The man's grin evaporated, terror flickering in his eyes. Willow, stand back, Evan instructed, but she ignored him, her gaze locked on the stranger, and Evan realized she remembered him. He was the one from whom she'd fled. The man fell back, dropping the rope. Look, old-timer, you're messing up, he rasped. You don't realize what that beast can do. Evan advanced, the rifle unwavering. The only mistake is yours, thinking you can waltz back in here. She isn't going anywhere, nor are her pups. Now get out before I force you. The man seemed torn momentarily, eyes darting from Evan to Willow. At last, he reversed course, retreating into the woods. Evan watched until he vanished, letting out a tense breath. He re-entered the cottage and slid the lock firmly in place, kneeling beside Willow, who still stood guard. It's all right, he whispered, stroking her fur. You scared him off. Willow exhaled, shakily, relaxing a fraction and leaning into Evan's hand. Frost and ember roused by the embers, and the fire squeaked for attention. Evan cradled them and tucked them next to Willow, who circled them in a protective stance. That night, with the flames crackling softly, Evan sat with Willow and her puppies at his side. Though the man might reappear, Willow wouldn't flee. She'd found her sanctuary, her family, and her courage. In turn, Evan felt he had discovered something essential, a purpose to shield and to cherish. For the first time in ages, Evan felt alive. Side by side, he and Willow had confronted that threat. Side by side, they would handle whatever might come. Willow's transformation from a freezing doorstep to the warmth of Evan's care was truly remarkable. Her strength, the bond formed with Evan, and her tireless devotion to her young underscored the profound effect of compassion and trust. Together they braved danger and overcame the haunting vestiges of Willow's old life, proving that even in dire circumstances, hope can flourish. Tales like Willow's remind us of the incredible bravery that animals demonstrate and the deep influence they can have in our world. If her journey touched you, let it stir you to action. Consider adopting, aiding a nearby rescue, or simply sharing this account to raise awareness. Subscribe to our page, like this post, and show it to someone who appreciates tales of perseverance and fresh starts. United, we can create change, a single rescue at a time. Thank you for joining us in this story.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.